Brilliant, so let's move on. The second paper is going to be Roland. Please, the floor is yours.
So good morning, everybody. So thanks very much for having me. Can you see my shared screen?
Yes.
Perfect. So as you see in the title now of the presentation, I have changed it. So whereas I have shared our paper, which was published in the British Journal of Industrial Relations about conflicts about EU referendums in France on the Constitution and in Ireland on the Fiscal Treaty and Lisbon 1 and 2. I started with that analysis. I started with this work, but I reframed it now in order to contribute to our debate about sovereignty conflict. And based on our work, I would like to bring in a word of caution in relation to a central concept that you're using in your research, namely the concept of sovereignty conflicts. So the question is, can the focus on sovereignty conflicts explain that we have seen in the last years? Okay. So now, I want to share, and it wouldn't, okay, how do I? All right, so now it works. So if you look at the current literature on the politicization of EU integration, we can distinguish different frameworks that are used. So Hoge and Marx, from a post-functionalist perspective, have highlighted the rise of culturalist or cultural conflicts in relation to, as a feature to explain rising Euroscepticism. Then the paper with Elodie Betu and Tara Golden and myself focuses on socioeconomic conflicts. And then we have the research team led by Hans-Peter Kriesi and Hutter and Grande, which emphasize both of these frames as an important point. You know, these discussions are important. They are not only arising academic questions, but as Chris in The Guardian recently stated, it has a big impact also on policy making. So if you take the culturalist approach, then as he would argue, UK Labour leaders have analyzed Brexit as evidence of working class xenophobia. On the other side, Swiss Labour leaders and Social Democrats didn't share that analysis, and they have linked the EU-Switzerland treaties on free movement and free trade to social flanking measures in order to better impose equal pay for equal work. And that seems to have worked because, as you have seen just 2 months ago, we have had another referendum on free movement, EU-Switzerland agreement, and we got a high yes vote in relation to that. But nevertheless, there is, of course, no questioning that we have seen an increasing politicization of European integration in recent years. And my argument is, or our argument is, that this is linked to a shift from horizontal market integration, where constraints were driven mostly by competition between economic actors across Europe in the so-called single market, to a more vertical policy regime where European institutions, courts, but also the European Union through directives, but also new economic governance interventions, have a much more direct say in policy making, even in fields that were shielded so far from EU policy making, like industrial relations. And so we have, as a result, the politicization, but then the politicization can follow, as you have seen, different frames: a culturalist frame, which would lead maybe to Brexit and nationalist resistance. but also socioeconomic frames, which have led to the European Citizens Initiative for Right to Water, for instance, or a European strike of the ETUC in 2012. It can lead to transnational mobilizations. But then the question is, how can we assess, which one of these two frames are really salient? And the problem is, if you look at workers, and we have analyzed that when we analyzed European economic governance interventions in the last 10 years, they face, on the one side, vertical interventions, but also neoliberal interventions. So we have a kind of a polity dimension and a policy dimension. And that raises important problems in terms of political and scientific classification struggles. So Bourdieu highlighted this methodological challenge when he said that any schema of classification is a stake or are stakes par excellence of political struggle. And that is, of course, true also in relation to these European conflicts that we are facing. So it depends very much. So it's not just a neutral analytical exercise to see whether something is driven by kind of culturalist frames or whether it's driven by policy concerns. And we see that when we actually look at these referendum debates, so Statham and Trends also analyzed the French referendum and others, and then they saw something surprising, that both pro-EU liberal and center-right politicians, but also anti-EU far-right leaders frame EU conflicts in culturalist terms. And that is, of course, still even more so today when we have Macron on the one side and Le Pen on the other side, or we have talked yesterday about Poland, where the left is also absent in the debate, and we have a kind of a similar polarization. But that has also been highlighted in the French debate with the Polish plumber theorem in relation to the Posted Workers Directive, which influenced, of course, the constitutional debate as well. Because that explanation, the culturalist explanation of the Polish plumber kind of rising xenophic, kind of the specter of a xenophic working class in France, that was first promoted by Bolkenstein, the commissioner himself. So, because he arguably had an interest in not talking about the socioeconomic problems linked to the Posted Workers Directive and the Service Directive. So that's the political side. Now we go to the scientific side of things. So we have Hutter, Grande, and Kriesi, and they kind of tried to analyze the salience or weight the salience of these competing frames using media debates. But I just want to share some of the problems that the coders, the poor coders that had to read these media articles were facing. So here is the only phrase that is related to industrial relations in their entire book. And it reads, another example in 2009 was the unofficial strike against EU directives taking precedence over jobs for British workers, as jobs were given to European contractors. So that relates to the so-called Lindsey oil factory dispute, where there was also a dispute about posted workers and wages, equal wages for equal work, etc., etc. So, but now we don't want to enter into the debate. I just want to ask you, just reflect. Imagine that you are a coder working for Kriesi's team. And now, how would you classify this phrase? Would you classify it as a evidence for a culturalist frame, or as evidence for a socioeconomic political conflict? The answer is, which has been given, if you look at their code book, how to code things, is, in this case, you would code it as both a socioeconomic and a culturalist conflict. And that maybe explains why, in the general conclusion, they are just sitting on the fence, arguing that political conflicts are driven by both. But in analytical term, that's not very satisfactory, isn't it? So if you say, if you look at something and then you say it's both, it's ambiguous. So then we don't really come forward with our analysis. So what are ways forward that we could pursue as scientists to maybe get a deeper understanding? The one first approach could be to just look, to do more in-depth qualitative analysis of the Lindsay dispute, and colleagues have done that. And then they see maybe if you go into, if you read these, it's maybe much more important. We try to do the same thing in our big European Research Council projects on new economic governance, looking at industrial relations, healthcare systems, water and transport policies in 4 member states that we study in more detail. But then what we also did in the past, and that's the basis of the paper by Betu, me and Golden, is to use another approach to media analysis, an approach that is inductive and not dependent on the coder's bias. So what did we do? We took the entire debate in these referendums, namely the 2005 referendum in France and the 8, 9, and 12 referendum in Ireland. And we took all articles in Le Monde and the Irish Times, plus 14 other national outlets, and then put the entire text in an ALCES database. And ALCES tries to is creating lexical classes. If you want to know more about the ALCES methodology, just look at the paper. But the main argument is that in phrases, the distribution of words are not random, but they are put together. So different words are put together in a thematic framework, and you do a kind of a cluster analysis to see what group of words are clustering together. And based on that, we created lexical classes, which helps us analyze the salience of different kind of frameworks in the referendum debates as represented in the national media. The first thing kind of confers Sri Lanka yesterday. So the biggest concern that we have seen in the debates was about politics, so power struggles between political leaders and parties, etc. But then the second important point is socioeconomic policy concerns. Policy concerns were second, and then polity concerns third. And if you look through the Irish case, that ranking kind of gets even stronger the later we go. So in the fiscal treaty, that was even more the case in that frame. Whereas in France, the order of the second and third was reversed. But most importantly, we didn't see any culturalist clusters and preference nationale and whatever one can imagine coming out of this lexical analysis, which is quite important because it goes against Hodge and Gary Marx's analysis. So now what is the conclusion for us if we talk about sovereignty conflicts? First, the takeaway point is, of course, directly from the conclusion of our paper. So socioeconomic rather than culturalist conflicts explain the growing salience of workers' Euroscepticism. But then in addition, I would like to add a word of caution against concept stretching. So we have seen in the previous presentation, and here I should quickly stop sharing. So we have seen the question that you would like to analyze is multi-level contestation. Okay.
This is impressive.
And then you look at the sovereignty conflicts. But what I would say, maybe that is concept stretching, because on the one side, we have also sovereignty conflicts are also about democratic legitimacy. If you go to the polity cluster of our analysis, we see that that second part is actually more central than the formal sovereignty claims. So maybe we should talk rather about polity conflicts. And then we should also talk about policy conflicts. Sorry. So it's okay. So policy is also key because, for instance, yesterday Dimitros said that the Swiss politicians wouldn't accept leading role of the European Court of Justice, for instance, in the current EU-Switzerland framework agreement that is currently negotiated. That's not entirely true because it depends very much on the policy frame. So the ECJ is accepted in all policy area as the interpreter of European law, but it's contested in relation to industrial relations, for instance, and the enforcement of wage standards. So there is the policy dimension is important, and my fear would be if you just focus on sovereignty conflicts, you miss out on the bigger dimension of the polity conflicts, including democratic legitimacy and also the important policy dimension, because I guess also in the TTIP discussion, it's not about just the formal sovereignty focus as such, but it's the content of these agreements that is key to understand contestation. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Roland. You certainly win the prize for the most technologically innovative and sophisticated presentation. I've never seen this before, but that was great fun.